Lately, what's been in the news a lot is whether or not there's going to be a war over Taiwan. But I think that's actually kind of framing it wrong. I think the war for Taiwan has already begun. It's not a boots on the ground war yet, but a psychological warfare, definitely. China has been increasingly aggressive in its flyovers of Taiwan. What's been driving this increased aggression?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think you're right. I think there is this war of nerves that's going on right now. And when you think about this recent international interest that everyone has paid towards Taiwan's defense, and it's not really a war scare, but certainly there's been a lot of talk of it in the international media recently. I think that's a positive thing. I think it's long overdue. This is an issue that most major media has avoided for a very long time. And it's only recently, now that a lot of things that have recently happened, that has kind of made it obvious that this is a real flashpoint and it's a real problem. The good news, of course, is very good. I think the good news is that there's no high likelihood of an invasion in the near term. But the bad news is also very bad. And that is, over the long term, I think we're very likely to see a major political military crisis here, and potentially even an all-out war.
And the bad news is long term is only 2 years away.
Well, that's an interesting debate that's gone on, is when the PLA might be ready. And nobody knows, right? Admiral Davidson famously said up on Capitol Hill that he thought the threat against Taiwan would manifest itself in the next 6 years, which really means between now and 2027. That's actually a fairly optimistic assessment from somebody in his position, because I remember back in 2017, 2018, the U.S. government was telling people, at least quietly, kind of behind closed doors, that they expected something to happen by 2025. They thought the PLA would be ready to invade and actually to defeat the United States, potentially, that they might have some confidence in doing that by the year 2025. And so something has happened in recent years which has pushed the potential timeline back. And so that's actually quite positive. But it's not that positive, right? Because it still means that this is a very serious threat, and that the U.S. government and the U.S. military thinks that there actually could be a conflict of this nature in the foreseeable future, right? I mean, 6 years is not that far off.
What do you think might have pushed it back a bit?
Well, I think the Pentagon, since probably 2018, 2019, has taken the threat much more seriously. To my very limited outside knowledge, they weren't that focused on defending Taiwan prior to that time. But during the early days of the Trump administration, it became a high priority. And over time, it's become even more of a priority, so much so that they started to come up with new innovative thinking and tactics, drills, exercises, all kinds of things to try to continually push back the Chinese Communist Party's timeline. Because at the end of the day, this is all about preventing war, right? The Pentagon's job is to prepare for war, but also to prevent it from happening in the first place. Because if something like this were to actually occur in the real world, it would be the worst strategic failure in American foreign policy since probably World War II. Even if we won the war, and I think we would regret it. We would regret ever coming to that place. This is something you never want to see happen, because it would be a nightmare for all sides. And so I think that they've started to take it much more seriously. They're starting to prepare for it. They're starting to do some new things with the Taiwanese government and military. And so they're starting to be able to push back the PLA's timeline. But at the same time, a lot of negative things have happened as well, right? We have seen genocide in Xinjiang, which is ongoing, and the international community has done very, very little about it. The reaction from most countries has been little to nil. And even in our own country, It's only very, very recently that the U.S. State Department even started to call it genocide, right? There was this 3-4 year long debate that went on inside the government before they could even decide on using the truthful terminology, right? And the same is true for other governments. And so, when you look at Xi Jinping and you say, my God, this man has become a genocidal dictator, that really starts to change your thinking about whether or not he's a rational actor, and whether or not he's somebody that can be deterred by the types of tools that the U.S. government traditionally assumed would work against a leader of the People's Republic of China. And so that's a very real problem. Hong Kong is also a very real problem. What has happened in Hong Kong, what Beijing has done there has been really shocking. And I think that's been a wake-up call as well.
So do you think it is still possible to prevent a boots-on-the-ground war?
Oh, without a doubt. There's no question that it's not only possible, but I think now that the U.S. government and the Pentagon is focused on this problem much more than ever before, and I think they're likely to become even more focused, unfortunately, for negative reasons in the years ahead, because, again, I think a crisis is becoming increasingly probable. I think they're going to start to make hard decisions that they just did not have the political will to make in the past. And the more they do that, then I think the less likely it will become that the Chinese Communist Party will ever be confident that they could actually successfully pull off an invasion of Taiwan. But again, that's just a guess, right? Coming from a novice amateur like myself, who knows what's really going on in the halls of power in Beijing? I don't know that anybody does. Who knows really what Xi Jinping's worldview is? I don't know. I've not read. I've read several biographies of Xi Jinping, and I've read a lot of his writings recently, but I've not seen anything that really gets inside of his head and that talks about, what his entire life was like and how that shaped his worldview. But what little we do know would suggest that he's very paranoid. He's very paranoid. And in many ways, he's very militant. And so he's likely to do things in the years ahead that will surprise us.
What are some of these hard decisions, Ian, that you were talking about that the Pentagon or the U.S. government are starting to make now that they'd been putting off before?
Well, one is just to openly talk about Taiwan. Previously, the Pentagon wouldn't talk about Taiwan. They would talk about what they were doing with every other country in the region, including the Cook Islands and Palau and places where you only have tens of thousands of people. And they wouldn't talk about Taiwan. I mean, it was remarkable. I remember going to a number of think tank events, conferences where you'd have U.S. government representatives in Washington, D.C., and they just would not talk about Taiwan. It's completely off limits for them. Now they're openly talking about it, which suggests they're taking it much more seriously. You're starting to see general officers, at least one-star generals, visit Taiwan, which they did not do in the past. You're starting to see some indications in public that there are military exercises going on between the U.S. and Taiwan. How big those are is not clear, but there are some indications that they are going on, things of that nature. In addition to arms sales, arms sales is kind of like the easiest thing the U.S. government can do is just start to approve arms sales. And they did that in a massive way last year in 2020, right? Pretty much everything the Taiwanese government requested, even things that previously had been completely off the table that nobody would ever consider, the U.S. government said, yes, sure, why not? All of it. It was really remarkable. And in many ways, that's the easiest thing to do. That's the first thing that the U.S. government's likely to do. Harder questions for the future are, do we start to send 4-star generals and admirals to Taiwan? Because if there is a political military crisis, President Biden or whoever follows him 4 years or 8 years from now, they're going to be in conferences and on video calls with men and women at the Pentagon who have no idea what they're talking about. he's going to be asking for the advice of senior military leaders who have never been to Taiwan. They've never seen the battle space. That's what would happen today. And I think it's obvious that would be very dangerous, right? But we have we have 2 colonels in Taipei that represent American defense interests, which is really stunning when you consider the magnitude of, this flashpoint. We have a 4-star general in command in Korea, and we have at least 1 3-star in Japan. And so it's pretty remarkable that, we're relying on the advice of colonels in the case of Taiwan, because colonels just don't see the world in the same way that a 4-star general or admiral would. And so I think that's an important decision for the future. I think it's something that we're likely to see start to happen. It could happen in secret. We might not know about it at first. Another is, again, bilateral military exercises, starting to put small numbers of troops in Taiwan, things of that nature, to try to make sure that our commitments to the defense of Taiwan are more credible. And if we continue to go forward with strategic ambiguity, which is actually not very credible at all, because we're publicly saying we don't know what we'll do, then at least we'll have a latent capability to defend Taiwan and be prepared if the president should have to order that in the future.